this. The students at home. My biggest classes are now at home. A lot of students studying from there, and so we want to record a couple of lectures, make sure that we get the best ones so they can watch it at home. And one of the things, I know this is world history, and we don't do political stuff here. I wonder if we get the microphone in the classroom turned off. I've got a lot of feedback. Um, so, perfect. Okay, that's much better. So now it'll record without that feedback. But one of the most important events in world history every single 4 years is the outcome of the American election. And the truth of the matter is, guys, this does have huge importance on the history of the world. I mean, it just does. So one thing I'm going to do, let's see if I can do this and just go through the settings here. Okay, so I can see you and you, but you can't see me. Can you see me okay? Raise your hand if you can see me all right. Oh, okay, so you can still see me. All right, okay, so let's do it this way. All right, so let's go ahead now and look at this first slide. And it should say 6 days until the election. Do you guys see that okay too? Raise your hands if you do, right? Okay, so we're on the right slide. All right, perfect, so it's working. Now here's the thing, 6 days away. This thing now has just snuck up on us, and it's pretty fascinating stuff. And again, we're not a class that's going to talk about politics, right? But what we are going to talk about is the importance of this election in terms of the history of the world. So we're going to look at this as if we were in England or we're in France or Germany or in Russia or in Japan, going, oh my goodness, whoever gets elected president has a big impact and a big say on what happens in the history of the world. It's just like they would be very interested, for example, in Mesopotamia, who the new Roman emperor would be. In Egypt, they would be wondering, right? So it's the same sort of thing, very important. And it looks like the race has tightened somewhat, that it's going to be a very close election in certain states, especially Florida, right? So when you guys organize your watch party, let's go ahead and get this picture of the family watching. Get a binge watch. Find something that you guys can watch together during the 45 or so minutes where there's really nothing new happening. What happens is that the polls start to close after people stop voting in that state. And in Florida, they are an East Coast time zone. So they're one of the first to shut down and start to post the results. When they start posting the results, we can get a bit of an indication that this is going to be a big election for one candidate or the other. It's going to be really, really close. So the Florida results are going to be early. North Carolina is another state to keep your eye on. Georgia is another state to keep your eye on. And then Pennsylvania. Those East Coast states are the ones to watch in the first few hours. So what you do is you watch for about 10 minutes, kind of see where it's at, then you put on a binge watch. Now I can highly recommend The Mandalorian. I know it releases on the 30th, but save it for 3 days. And that night maybe you can watch The Mandalorian, or there's a bunch of stuff, Enola Holmes, for example, is really good on Netflix. But find something, maybe you take on Harry Potter from the beginning, or the Avengers series, or something like that. But take 45 minutes off, enjoy a movie. Oh, it's almost 8 o'clock. Stop, go to your TV, go to your major stations, and watch what's happening. And so I think you'll have fun if you do it. And it's going to be a very close election. One of the big changes that's happened in this election that we haven't seen since the election of President Obama, and that is that young people from ages 18 to 30 are turning out in droves. If you look at their voting pattern in history, people that age group, I was that age group when it happened, 18 to 21-year-olds got the right to vote. They got the right to vote during the Vietnam War because you could go and be drafted into the army and go to Vietnam and fight for your country, and die for your country, but you couldn't vote. So everybody thought that was kind of unfair. So an amendment would pass through the constitutional process really quickly, and suddenly young people 18 to 21 had a chance to vote. And in that first election, boy, they were excited. We all showed up. We all showed up and voted because it was new. But after that, no, that's boring now. And just no. In fact, the worst voter group in terms of turning out and voting in a high percentage is young people 18 to 30. Notoriously bad voters. In fact, the truth is you don't even campaign at them because there's not enough of them to change an election one way or the other. Now, when Obama comes along, he's a different story. He generated a lot of enthusiasm among young people. In fact, they drove his campaign to success. And so, for the first time since the 1970s, young people in 2008 showed up to vote for Obama. And they showed up again for him 4 years later in 2012. Now, they weren't interested in Hillary Clinton. And so many of them, in fact, didn't like the Hillary Clinton, and they actually voted for Trump. Some 4 million voters, that young people that had voted for Obama, voted for Trump. And Trump ekes out a narrow victory. In this election, though, something's changed big time among young people. Young people are voting in record numbers. Look at this in Texas. 753,000 Texans, young people under the age of 30, have voted, and 4 years ago, only 106,000 did. This has the potential to completely change this election. Look at Florida, right? I think President Trump wins Florida easily were it not for these numbers, because younger people tend to vote for, Biden, about 60-40 roughly across the country. So this is good news for Biden in a state like Florida, where you've got 815,000 early ballot requests, and last time there were less than 300,000. 400, almost half of them have already voted. North Carolina, it's going to become important. Georgia, Biden has a slim chance in Georgia because of this right here. So we're going to see what happens there. But it's interesting what's going on in the country with the youth vote. Now, the number one issue, of course, is the coronavirus, right? That's the number one issue. Which president, Biden or Trump, is going to do a better job of getting us through this very difficult winter and getting us back to normal, right? Will it be Biden or Trump? And right now, the United States is leading the world in infections as of, well, when India got theirs more under control, as you see here. France is having some troubles. You can see Europe now is going through a new surge. Everybody knew this was going to happen. They knew that this winter would be worse than last. So we all have to wear our masks. We all have to do our part, because now's the time where it really matters. And if you care about people, if you care about others, wear your mask, socially distance, stop the spread, because we have the highest case count, the highest rate of infection that Utah's ever had since the beginning of this thing. And we all need to now, more than any other time, do our part. And again, this is not a political statement. I'm not picking sides here. I'm just saying the vote will come down to who Americans feel can do the best job of getting us through this next difficult 6 months and the next year after that with the economic fallout, because this is really tearing our economies apart and causing huge unemployment. So it's a big decision, and it's going to be fascinating to see what happens. The best campaign ad I have seen in this campaign is this one right here. It's just an epic ad. It'll go in the vault of great political ads. Here we go.
A mask can say a lot about the person who wears it. But even more about the person who doesn't.
There you go. And I think at a time of crisis like we're in right now, we got to take care of each other, right? And so that's really this election is going to hinge on. Is going to be on the virus. And again, not making a political statement here. I'm just saying this is the issue that's driving this election, and Americans in 6 days are going to decide who they want to lead us in the next 4 years. All right, so now let's get back to Rome. And Rome, of course, was, they had some issues, as you know. When Rome got wealthy, okay, it got weird. It basically sacrificed some of its own principles, right, in this period. And I'm getting the wrong lecture. I need to move this down. My bad here. Should have got this. Yeah, there it is. Got the right one. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to just review just a little bit, because basically we were talking about the key changes that came as a result of the Roman Empire becoming this vast money-making machine. All right. So once they took Carthage, they inherited all the wealth that Carthage had been accumulating, and they inherited all that trade, and they were 6 times wealthier than they were before they defeated Carthage in the Second Punic War. Now, with all that new wealth, they realized, hey, you know, the more we expand, the more lucrative it's going to be. And who benefits from that? Well, it's the patrician class, the senatorial class. They were the ones that were being sent out as consuls to fight, taking over areas. And as a result, they got land and all that. And then we saw a big social change because they're constantly at war. The small farmers who were the bedrock in Italy of the Roman legion, they were basically fighting for their, today we'd say country, right? They wouldn't consider it a country. It's a different concept country than what they would have experienced. But nevertheless, we're going to fight for Rome because it's an act of citizenship. We're citizens or half citizens. And so we're fighting for our own people, right? Well, but here's what happened. The farmers were constantly at war. So because they're constantly at war, guess what? They can't maintain their farms anymore. They become landless when they get older. And the rich patrician class, let me shut this door here. The rich patrician class was picking up all these farms and forming these large estates. Now, because there weren't these bedrock of society farmers anymore so much, they then started to bring slaves in by the tens of thousands, taking the farming jobs away from the farmers that had been doing it for the first 500 years of Roman history. Now, you move to the slums of the city of Rome or some other place like that, and you either served in the military or, you know, what did you do? And so they literally had to start bringing grain in to feed all these people free because they just simply had too many slums in Rome, and Rome kept growing because you now had these landless people. Now, some of those were veterans. Why can't you allow these veterans land after they serve in the Roman legion? There were some people who had some different ideas on this. They had created a social problem. Society was now different because of all the victories, because of the empire, because of the wealth. And the rich had become richer and the poor had become poorer. And they are ruling what we call a plutocracy. It's ruled by the rich. Well, a couple of rich guys named the Gracchi brothers, we talked about these guys here. And basically the whole history from here on in is going to be the history of two people, two people, two people, and then three people. Okay, so let's talk about these pairs. The first pair would be the Gracchi brothers, and that's these two guys right here. And they were rich patrician noblemen who then were tribunes representing the average everyday people in the assembly. And they're listening to all these people going, oh my goodness, we got a problem here. Let's take up their cause. Let's do some reforms, some changes that can make their lives better. And so they proposed this. There's land out there that we've taken over that nobody owns. Let's give that to the peasants, to the plebeians. Let's also make the conditions of the army better. And let's give them some sort of land when they retire that they can retire to. And oh, by the way, every time we fight, it gets so corrupt as to who gets the spoils of that war. Let's start being a little more fair with the equal treatment of people and the spreading out of the wealth to more people. And by the way, let's expand the vote. Let's expand the voting rights to more and more people, like the half citizens. Let's turn them into full citizens, even certain groups of non-Romans. Now, here was the reaction. When the first brother proposed this to the Senate, the senators broke the chairs that they were sitting on, broke them apart, turned them into clubs, and killed them right there. Oops. Now there were riots that followed because the people, every people were saying, wait a minute, these are our champions. They're representing us and you're killing, what? See, the senators were so offended that somebody would ask to share their wealth with somebody else that they got rid of the messenger, so to speak. You don't want to kill the messenger because it's the message that matters. Now, about 10 years later, the younger brother, Tiberius Gracchus, he comes up with even more proposals after more things had gone wrong, after it was obvious that things weren't working, and he takes them to the Senate too. And the Senate again rejects it. So he goes out and says, okay. And so now all of a sudden this huge mob forms. And one of the senators says, I'll tell you what, I will give the weight of Tiberius Gracchi's head in gold if somebody kills him. Well, somebody did. And then thinking, oh, I want to maximize how much money I'm going to make here, he filled his head with lead and handed it to the guy paying the bounty, and it got 17 pounds of gold. Again, there were riots, but then, of course, the Roman Senate had more power and they were able to quell those riots. But this was just a portent of things to come. The truth of the matter is, greed had taken over. They were no longer a Republican oligarchy, but a Republican plutocracy, ruled by the rich for the rich. And the people that were the foundation of Rome, those small farmers, now were paying the price. The army's now paying the price too, because the army wasn't working anymore like it had in the past. And so Marius was a general at the time, and they're getting beat. They got beat in northern Italy. They got beat in Africa. They beat in Anatolia. They've got barbarians, the Teutonics and the Cambri attacking. They got wars all over the place. And the legion isn't the same legion anymore because it's not made up of these citizen warriors, right? So he proposes a bunch of changes, reform. Let's get rid of the citizen army of farmers called in temporary service. Let's not do that anymore. Let's instead make it a professional job where this is all you do. A well-disciplined standing army, mean full-time in the army. Okay, so the army became your full-time career. Now that meant they would hire anybody that could fight, including people that were no longer from the Italian peninsula, not even in Roman. They might hire the Nubians from Africa, and they're like cavalry. They might hire, the Cambrians, the Gauls, the Celts, whoever to fight. So the Roman legion, bit by bit, becomes non-Roman. Those tribes in Spain, let's hire them and train them in the way we fight. And this is going to be bad in the long term because basically you're training your enemy on how you fight. Because somewhere down the road, maybe that tribe will turn against you. But they're now hiring a mercenary force. And you guys remember what happened to Carthage when they did that? But even at that, they had the strongest army in the Mediterranean. But this also meant that the soldiers in the legions now were not loyal to Rome, not loyal to that concept of being a Roman citizen, but they were loyal to their general. And in this case, they're loyal to Marius. All right, now, here's the thing. How do you keep the mob happy when the mob's unhappy? When the people of Rome, growing to now a million people, which is huge in the ancient world. No city anywhere had been that large. I mean, it was just insane. A big city would be 5,000, 10,000 people in those days. One of the big cities in the Mediterranean was Athens. At its height was only 300,000. Well, it's called panem and circenses, right? Bread and circuses. Basically, let's feed them so they don't riot, because hungry people tend to riot. Let's just bring in food from Sicily, North Africa, Egypt, free food, so you don't riot. That's how rich these people were. They could afford to do this. Oh, and then give them a party every day. Now, when you see circuses, you guys are thinking like elephants and clowns and the big tent. No. What they meant there was the Circus Maximus, which was chariot racing, bread and chariot racing, and gladiatorial contest. So the power of the Senate, although they wouldn't have admitted it at the time, was declining, and the power of generals was rising. And now what's going to happen is Rome is going to start to gradually descend into military dictatorships. But you got to keep the people happy. So what they did was organize these massive gladiatorial contests. They even built in Rome, and by the way, these were all over the Roman Empire, all over the Mediterranean, they were doing this. But here was the big one, right? This is the big show, right? This was like the Super Bowl of gladiator contests, was the Colosseum in Rome. And it was built in these layers. And by the way, depending on your class, if you were a patrician, you entered this way. There were stairs that came up. And if you were just plebeian here, and if you were, some sort of slave or whatever, you sat up here. And they would pack 60,000 or so people in here. And the people fighting were slaves. So they had these slaves, has some athletic ability, whatever, and they trained them to fight. And then they'd fight these duels. And sometimes to the death. Now, here's the thing. After a big fight, the emperor would sit up in his throne chair and he would go thumbs up if he thought, well, what a great fight that was. Let's let the guy that got defeated live. Thumbs up. Thumbs down. Nah, kill him. Right in front of 60,000 people. Commit murder on my thumb up or thumb down. We still go thumbs up to this day, just like the Romans do. And we still do things like this all the time. You look at American football. American football is a brutal game. I think we talked about this last time. If we didn't, let me repeat it really quick. But it's a brutal game. The concussions, the injuries, and people just cheer when there's this massive hit and somebody gets knocked unconscious. That's not really normal behavior, is it? Or are we just kind of doing gladiator contests light? Maybe not to the death, but wow. There's people, lifelong injuries, just playing that game of football just to keep the people happy. You give somebody a big screen TV, a football game, and a remote control, and they're happy for 3 hours, and they're not worried about other things. Maybe this entertainment can be a negative. The Colosseum was an amazing place. Thing that with Rome is they built these amazing aqueducts that would bring water from all over Italy, miles and miles and miles, to bring water into the city. So it was never without water. It was amazing engineering. At one point, though, they actually created aqueducts that would come into here, and they would seal this floor. So what would happen is they had this underground area right here. And this is where the gladiators would be preparing for the fights. And then there would be pulley systems that would open up. There would be this kind of wooden platform across the top. And there would be these hatch doors, and the hatch doors would open, and the gladiators and the lions that they were to fight, or the animals they were to fight, or each other would come up from the floor. It was massive theater. It's like a big theatrical presentation. It was like the Super Bowl halftime show. Right. Well, they decided, well, why don't we do a sea battle? How do we do that? Well, they figured out how to seal this off, and they got these aqueducts built, and they put water in here and flooded the bottom part of it. And it actually had boats, and they actually had fights right there in the Colosseum. They actually had a lake too nearby that they made just to go out and to reenact famous sea battles that the Romans had fought, maybe against the Carthaginians, or the Battle of Actium, which we're going to be talking about here soon. Wow. All that to keep the people entertained. They would have these contests almost every other day, 180 days a year. They would have these very expensive celebrations, and they were paid for by the massive wealth being brought into Rome. By far, though, the sport that people loved the most in Rome and all throughout the Mediterranean was chariot racing. And this had kind of been true since Pharaoh's time. The thing is, you get 4 horses across with a chariot rider, and you put 8 of those teams across the Circus Maximus, which was a big oval in the middle of Rome. The only way I can compare it today is to go to a NASCAR track. You go to a NASCAR track, it's a big oval, you get like 100 vehicles, all 100 cars, all racing each other around and around and around. And people are watching, oh, look who's ahead, look who's behind, look at that pass, look at that turn. And of course, obviously what's going to happen at some point, there's going to be a collision. And everybody goes, oh, look at that collision. Isn't that terrible? Oh, watch this one. Oh, there's another collision. It's like they love the collisions. These would be that way too. There's nothing more impressive than 4 massive mashed horses pulling a chariot side by side with another 4 horses. And it is a scary but awesome sight. And there would be like as many as 8 chariots at a time going around this oval again and again and again. And sometimes the chariots would flip over completely, and the chariot guy would be trampled by the next coming through. It was brutal stuff, but wow. I don't know if you've ever seen horses stampeding before, if you've ever seen horses at full gallop. We were driving through Mapleton. There's this big field, right? And there were some kids out there. They were on horseback. They had three of them. They were on horses. And as we came around the corner, they decided to race us the whole length of the field they were in. Big long road, big long field. And so they just took off. It was a sight. It was so impressive. And those young people knew how to ride. You know, you can go out and sit on a horse and it can carry you around, but a real rider, that's kind of a rare thing. And we just stopped. It was so impressive. It was so powerful. And we just stopped. Did you guys do, and these were girls, do you guys do barrel racing and rodeo? And they all kind of smiled and said, yeah. And it was pretty obvious. I mean, wow. It's a sight. And horses were a big part of the ancient world. And these became the most popular things. Well, you'd have your favorites, right? Just like sports teams today. You have like the Raiders from Las Vegas, or you've got the Philadelphia Eagles, or you've got the New England Patriots, or you got the Green Bay Packers. And people would wear the colors of their chariot team. It got so bad in Byzantium, which was, of course, that last phase of Roman history. It got so bad in Byzantium that they had 4 major horse-drawn teams of chariot racers. And they would do races about every, couple, 3 weeks. And so they divided into teams, and the whole city would pick their teams. So depending on what part of the city you were in, this is the city of Constantinople, which actually grew bigger than Rome at one point. In Constantinople, and you'd pick your teams. And then what happened is people started to fight. It started to become more than just a sport. It became a way of life. Eventually, the red and yellow teams kind of disappeared because they didn't win enough, I guess. And it came down to 2 teams, the greens and the blues. And they could mobilize the greens or the blues into mobs or whatever. And they were often used as political tools to overthrow the government and install new leaders. The sport had turned into a political tool, because you could always mobilize the blues and the greens by saying, the greens are doing this, they're trying to do this, let's take over the government. And the blues would do it, or vice versa. Now that's taking your chariot racing a little too far. All right, so now we're keeping the people happy by giving them races, by giving them all sorts of games and feeding them, right? Keeps the masses happy. But here's the thing. They weren't keeping the people out in the country very happy. The Latins, who we remember back in our earlier lecture, got half citizenship. Well, now they're saying, look, we've been here for hundreds of years, supporting you every which way. We supported you through Hannibal. We provided troops through this whole thing. Now things are changing here. We want full citizenship. We've earned it. We deserve it. And half of the territory in southern Italy rebelled. You know, the Greek portion, Magna Graecia, and the Latin portion just above that, they all rebelled. It was a big war. It was a terrible war. It didn't last long, but the Romans realized that they had to grant the citizenship or they were going to have another war on their hands and so on. So while Rome did win that war, they did give in to the demands, which was smart. But then, remember, half the population of Rome are slaves. And so we get these slave revolts, 1, 2, 3 major slave revolts, where tens of thousands of armed slaves formed armies and started to fight in Italy and Sicily. Now, the first ones they put down pretty regularly with the Roman legion. Remember, the Roman legion now are more mercenaries and they're fighting for their generals. Crassus put one down. He's going to become important later. Another, Sulla put one down. But there was a gladiator who took 200 other gladiators and they basically fled and formed an army. His name was Spartacus. And this is called the Third Servile War. So this is the third one of those slave revolts. Now, by the time he gets done with 200 escaped gladiators, remember, these guys were trained in war. They were trained to fight. And so they formed a legion of their own. They knew how the Romans fought and they knew ways to defeat them. And they had 120,000 slaves run away and join them. This was one of the toughest fights the Roman legions would ever have. They lost battle after battle of Spartacus. He was like another Hannibal, it seemed like. But eventually, he was sold out by some of his supporters, and Spartacus suffered a loss and he was captured, and 6,000 of his followers were caught and literally crucified along the Appian Highway leading into Rome as an example to other slaves. Well, that ended the slave rebellions. But wow. So Spartacus is a symbol now of freedom, but he failed. He failed to accomplish the liberty that he wanted. Basically, wanted all of these people that were under him to be given citizenship and to be allowed little farms of their own and to live happily ever after. And Rome wasn't going to give in to that. At the same time, all of this is going on. Way off in the east, there's a little Greek kingdom called Pontus that's decided that they're sick and tired of the Romans encroaching in on Greece. So what happens is this Mithridates, and now that, by the way, don't get confused here because there's lots of Mithridates. There's the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth king, and they all have the same name. All right. So rather than be too confusing, we're going to go through several of these, right? Now, this Mithridates, I believe he was the fifth, actually then liberated part of Greece from Roman control. So what happens is this, I'm going to go to a map. This is Pontus. This is where this new army is coming from. And these areas were allied with Greece, but basically they were just under Greek Roman protection. But they managed to liberate them and part of the Greek city-states along here, along the Ionian coast. So Mithridates, right, it becomes public enemy number one. So who do you turn to? Well, you turn to the guy that reformed the army, Marius, right? Well, they didn't. They gave command, I'm talking about the Senate now. They gave command to go after Pontus, to go after Mithridates, to one of his subordinate generals named Sulla. Now, Sulla was a very effective general, and he went off to fight with his legion. Marius got really upset. So he forms a coup d'etat to take over the Roman Senate, makes himself dictator, and then he does something new in Roman history. He starts to massacre all of his opponents. Anybody that opposed Marius was killed. And these are senators, right? These are patricians. Now, there's some greedy people who took advantage of this. And as one senator was killed, he went and stole their estates. His name was Crassus. He would steal their lands from them, made himself the richest man in Rome during this time period. But Marius had turned, his mind had gone. He was once a great hero with dignitas. Now he's doing all this. He's purging Rome of anybody that might disagree with him. And he orders Sulla, who has been sent off to fight Mithridates, as a traitor. Well, Sulla wins out there against Pontus. These are kind of some of the maps. We won't worry about the maps. But Sulla then finally wins, but then he returns with his now loyal army. And by the way, Marius had not made a lot of friends in Rome. And so Sulla, by the way, you can tell him because he got his nose chopped off in a fight. Sulla defeats Marius, his once mentor. And then he does the same thing. He becomes dictator in 82, another reign of terror. Another hundreds of Roman aristocrats are arrested and killed without trial for supporting Marius. Then Sulla retires after his dictatorship was up. And now the leaders of Rome had fallen to two other men who had made themselves very wealthy during all of this turmoil. One was Pompey, and the other was Crassus. Now, Crassus, of course, was, let me go a picture of him real fast, see if I can get Crassus here. Yeah, there he is. Crassus became the wealthiest man in Rome. In fact, if you would go back to the American Revolution period, because they studied Rome a lot, they would say, he's as rich as Crassus. Like the king of England, be as rich as Crassus, be the richest man in the world, right? It'd be like Jeff Bezos today, right? He's the Jeff Bezos of the Roman Empire. And I just want to show you a picture before I show you what goes on. All right, now Pompey then is very wealthy too. He's got his own army. Now remember, the armies are now loyal to their generals and not loyal to that. This guy never went into the Senate and followed the course of honor where you wait till you're a certain age and you take this position, you get elected consul and doing it the traditional Republican way. He just said, hey, I am so cool. I got my own army. I'm going to pretty much kind of start to run this place with my buddy Crassus. Okay, so let's see. Now, what the Senate does, though, is they say, hey, Pompey, all right, fine. I know you're not old enough to be a consul, but we're going to make you consul anyway. In fact, we're going to make you dictator. But you got to go get these pirates. There are these pirates, the Sicilian pirates that were stealing a lot of food and ships and supplies that were coming into Rome. So he does. He puts a navy together, goes out and wins. And he does such a good job that the Senate says, okay, now Mithridates the sixth now is back at it again in Pontus. Sulla, of course, put away his father. Now his son is causing problems. Go out there. You can be dictator now until you kill that man, until you kill Mithridates the sixth. Okay, so Pompey takes his army and his navy and he goes out there to Anatolia, takes it, takes Syria, takes Palestine. He expands the empire big time because he defeated Mithridates rather early. Now we need to get to the map. Let me show you this. This is Pontus right here. And then they had one point controlled all of this. And then they had been pushed back, right, by Pompey and by Sulla. All right, so they're no longer a factor. But Mithridates the sixth was not killed in the final battle. He ran away. He's in hiding. And Pompey loves this because as long as he's alive, he can keep expanding Roman territory and making the wealth from that himself as long as that guy's still alive. And so he took advantage of that to take Syria, Mesopotamia, this area here, took Phoenicia. He works his way down the Fertile Crescent, takes Judea. This is kind of important because this is where Christ was born, here in Nazareth. He takes that, and then he takes Jerusalem too, the holy Jewish city, but also where Christ was killed, and also one of the sacred sites of Islam. So what I'm telling you is, because of Pompey, right, the entire Judea, Palestine, Israeli area today becomes part of the Roman Empire. So the history of the rise of Christianity and the fate of the Jews, who basically kept rebelling against the Romans, and they were all destroyed and cast into countries all over the world. The whole religious history of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam was all impacted by Roman history now. It all became one history tied together. So this is a really important event for future religious history, having the Romans come in and take this area over. But then Mithridates goes and dies of natural causes. And so when that happens, Pompey had to return to Rome, which he did. And now a new situation has arisen because his buddy Crassus is back there making a fortune and kind of running things. And he comes back having won these great victories and expanded the Roman Empire. By the way, all of these people, Pompey and the guy we're going to talk about next, believed they were the next reincarnation of Alexander the Great. And of course, Alexander the Great thought he was, Achilles. So you go all the way back to Homer for their inspiration. And of course, Achilles was blessed by the gods. He was, had godness in him. And so with other leaders, if you go down through history, when leaders declare themselves from the gods, a god themselves, that's pretty scary. And one young man with a lot of wealth and power, growing young man, by the name of Julius Caesar. Remember that guy? Remember the guy that did the calendar thing and whatever? Well, he now has his own army too, and he's pretty powerful, becomes very influential in the absence of Pompey. And he's at a funeral for one of his great aunts or grandmas or whatever, and he's giving the eulogy, but instead of talking about the person who passed away, no, instead he talks about how he is a descendant of a god and he is going to become the greatest Roman. Oh boy. So this is Caesar. And he becomes now another dictator. So what we've got is three of them. We've got Caesar, we've got Pompey, who's just beat Mithridates the sixth, and then Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. So now all of a sudden we had three people all fighting for power. So early on, what they decided to do was, let's rule together. The Roman Senate had become just a rubber stamp for whatever they wanted to do. And this group is called the First Triumvirate. That's a key thing. That's a great term. Triumvirate means three, right? Three. So I do triathlon, which is swim, bike, run, three sports in one. Three. Triumvirate. right? 3 generals. So Rome is now under the leadership of these 3 generals: Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. Each of them have their own private armies, and they decide, guess what? Why don't we divide up Rome among ourselves? So the red area was given to Caesar, which was the least wealthy area. The Italy was, of course, the real power center with Rome in the middle. And of course, it was the wealthiest city. Pompey decided to rule from there so he could control the Senate and everything else. And he turned his buddy Crassus out here to rule the rest of the empire. And Crassus continued, because this was the wealthiest part of the empire, continued to make money hand over fist. But Pompey, of course, felt like he was in the power center. Now, Caesar, of course, he's got the least productive. I mean, he's still wealthy beyond belief. But this area here shouldn't be red yet. It's not conquered yet. This area, Italian Gaul, long-haired Gaul, Belgica, Germanica, these were tribal areas of what they called Gauls, but they would have been Celts. And they had not yet been defeated and fallen under the Roman rule. So what happens is Caesar goes out here with his legion and spends the next 10 years defeating them. And it really wasn't a fair fight. I mean, yeah, there were some big battles and these were big tribes, and so it was difficult. But what Caesar did was use it as an opportunity to capture slaves, maybe 1 to 2 million slaves. It made him very, very rich. I'm going to jump ahead. And then he writes a book. He was a skillful propagandist. He would send these chapters of his life story back to Rome where people would read it and eat it up. Oh my goodness, look at what he did here. Look how he did that. He was the hero, of course, in all of these stories. It's called the Gallic Wars. And he presented himself in this as the greatest living Roman. Now if you're Pompey, you're thinking, wait a minute, I fought worse enemies than that. How come I'm not getting the love? Well, the truth is this was working. And people were looking at Caesar as the next reincarnation of Alexander the Great. Well, the 10 years comes to an end. He starts to march back to Rome with his army. And the Roman Senate, led by Pompey, told him to, okay, disband your army and come in to Rome. Now, the southern boundary of Caesar's area that he was to control, Gaul, stopped at this river called the Rubicon. And this is really an important river. It's called the Rubicon River, because what he was supposed to do is what all armies did: disband their army, leave their weapons behind, come into Rome and have a big party. And the party was called a triumph. And the triumph was like this. Here's what happened. They'd have a big parade. They'd bring in all of the captive leaders that they had. They were, of course, in chains and whatever, and humiliate them as they marched through. All the slaves that they brought with them that they were going to sell would be marched through. All of the things they stole, all the gold, all the treasures of the people that they had taken it from, that would be on display. This would be miles long. And then the soldiers would come through too, and it'd be like a big party. It's like after World War II in Times Square, New York, where our soldiers came back from World War II, World War I as well. And there's Eisenhower and everybody's throwing confetti out and there's this big party. Well, that was a triumph. But guess what? Caesar decides to do something else. He decides to bring his very loyal army that he was paying and had just made very wealthy into Rome itself, fully armed, and to take over. As soon as he crossed that river, he had committed an act of treason. To cross the Rubicon, really important phrase here. To cross the Rubicon means to pass the point of no return. It refers to Julius Caesar's army crossing the Rubicon in 49 BC, very important date in Roman history. It was an act of treason, no doubt about it. But Caesar uttered a famous phrase at the time. I won't bother with the Latin, but I'll tell you in English what it said. It says, the die is cast. Now, what a die is kind of like a mold. It's a part that you make. And when you use it in a machine, it makes the same thing over and over again. When you make a die, you can't change what's going to happen with it. It's going to do what you've designed it to do. And so this phrase, the die is cast, means no going back, victory or death. And Caesar crosses the Rubicon and heads toward Rome. Now, Pompey didn't think that he would do this. Pompey's army is over here in Greece. They had no time to defend Rome against his invasion. And so Pompey fled. And suddenly Caesar now is the supreme ruler of the Roman city and the Italian peninsula and all the area he's at. Pompey has fled across to the Greek portion of the empire and is preparing for war, and a great civil war will now ensue. All right, with that being said, I'm going to go to another point in history. This point of history is the American Revolution. We're going to make a comparison here now. Remember, I told you we don't have time to do modern history, right? Because we only meet 2 days instead of 5. But we do need to bring it up to the present, or at least up to modern history. And so the American Revolution is an important event in modern history. But there's some parallels between George Washington and Julius Caesar that we're going to talk about. Here's the thing. If I were explaining the American Revolution in a class in France or a class in England or whatever, they'd only give me like, 20 minutes to explain it, because there's so much history in France that, to spend 20 minutes on the American Revolution would seem like almost excessive. So I'm going to explain it from a world history perspective, how it would be explained to other people, maybe kids in Germany or maybe kids in Japan or wherever. Basically, here's the deal. The Americans in Boston decide to revolt against Britain and to break away up in Massachusetts. And after some time, there was a group called the Second Continental Congress that had representatives from 13 colonies that were the British colonies in North America. England had many colonies, had like 30 of them, but 13 of them decided to rebel. And in Virginia, a southern colony, they had a great leader who had war experience. He had been a top commander during an earlier war called the French and Indian War. His name was George Washington. Now, George Washington also was a colonel at that time, and he also had tremendous military experience. But he was also the wealthiest man in Virginia, too. And when the revolution starts, he goes to the Virginia convention where they're discussing whether or not they should go and fight on behalf of these people in Boston. A famous guy named Patrick Henry gave a speech, "Give me liberty or give me death," and they were all inspired by that. And they voted George Washington and others to go to the Second Continental Congress to represent Virginia and to figure out how to fight this war. And while he goes there, it's now in Philadelphia, they're meeting in the Second Continental Congress, and everybody's looking around, and there's one guy wearing a uniform. His name was George Washington. He's about 6'2", taller than everybody else. When he spoke, everybody listened. He had amazing charisma. And they said, let's make him the commander-in-chief. So they voted him in as commander-in-chief and sent him up to Boston, which had been occupied by the British, where fighting had been going on now for months. He finds some officers, Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox, some generals. He gets some help from a Frenchman by the name of the Marquis de Lafayette, very important French kid. And then he gets a German drill sergeant to help train his forces. And he puts a team together to create the American Continental Army. Now, what happens is he's so clever in Boston that he manages to get the British to leave without even having to fire a shot. So early on, he wins a big victory without even having to fire a shot. But he knew that after he kicked the British out of Boston, that they were going to come back. And where were they going to come? New York City. New York City was small by comparison to today, but it was the strategic heart of the colonies, with the Hudson River along the Atlantic coast, and it was a group of islands. And so he brought his army down from Boston, and he starts to set up the defenses of New York City. And it was a colossal mistake. He had about 12,000 men is all, and he was facing an army that the British had sent of 34,000 troops, 30 warships, each with 80 guns, being able to just blow anything away, the greatest navy in the world, and 400 transport ships. He had about 12,000 men and no navy at all. And he's got to defend a bunch of islands. This is not going to work. And it was a humiliating defeat. The first battle took place here in Brooklyn Heights, and he loses, and he managed to sneak this army over to Manhattan, where he had more troops. And then the British attack New York City, and then he's forced to flee, and he manages to flee up this coastline. The British land some amphibious forces here and chase him up the island. He would lose 9,000 of his men in the defense of New York. He was beat to a pulp. In fact, this army that the British had sent was the biggest army sent since Roman times. Okay, looks like the period's about to end, right? Okay, well, let's stop right there and we'll finish this story next time around. Okay, plan your party, guys, that you view the election. Find a good binge watch and enjoy what happens next Tuesday night.